How do you think maybe technology could have helped to speed any of that process up?
If we had something like Solidar, where we could have seen just about everything. I mean, you can jump ahead, you can go backwards. Your website would have been really helpful in terms of determining what was in front of us. When it's all laid out there, the way you guys have done it would have been very helpful.
Yeah.
The knowledge is so spread out and not centralized. I mean, things like that you do in terms of determining sale prices would have been much faster and much more organized and much more comprehensible. You, the owner, can play with the numbers yourself, ask all sorts of, if I understood it right, a lot of what if questions. What's really good about it is that owner can come into that and see how they don't have to necessarily just sell to private third parties. They can go, look at this. This is, if I follow this process, I can get this done. And if they have attitudes like mine, which were, I want to protect my employees, or I just think this is a great idea, it would have been invaluable.
Today, my guest is Jerry Skomer. Jerry is the former owner and president of Alternative Technologies, where he led a thoughtful and values-driven transition to employee ownership via a worker cooperative. Throughout his journey, Jerry balanced his two top priorities, ensuring he had enough financial security for retirement and protecting the future employment of his longtime employees. In this conversation, Jerry tells us how he explored a management buyout before employee ownership, but then quickly found out his leadership team was not interested in risking their homes as collateral. He also shares how he navigated the complexities of learning his business's value, from trying to understand terms like EBITDA and multiples with the help of his CPA, to ultimately realizing that valuation is a market-driven proposition. Check out the show notes where we've defined all the terms used in this conversation. What was Jerry's greatest challenge? Learning to trust the process, letting go of control, and trusting his team to take on greater leadership, even when their approach felt less agile and more risk-averse than his own. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe and follow it on your favorite podcasting app or YouTube. It's the best way to stay connected and helps the show tremendously. With that, I bring you Jerry Skomer of Alternative Technologies. Let's ride. All right, welcome back to the Bicycle for the EO Mind podcast. I have with me today the former owner and president of Alternative Technologies, Jerry Skomer. How are you today, Jerry?
Well, thank you. And you?
Doing well, thanks. Really appreciate you being with us today.
My pleasure.
So, what is your favorite quote and why?
That's a good question. There are several quotes I like, but the one I've been thinking of lately is a lyric from a song by Laurie Anderson. I don't know if you know who she are. She's an experimental. She was an experimental musician, married to Lou Reed for a number of years. She wrote a song called Ramon, and the song is what I like about the song is maybe the most compassionate lyrics I've ever read in any song. It really exemplifies something or a standard worth living to. And I think in today's climate, with everything going on over the past few months, this song has resonated with me, and it goes something to the effect, well, this is just one lyric. I'm not going to do the whole song. God knows I'm not going to try to sing it. So anyway, but the song, the lyric, the stanza that I like says, so when you see a man who's broken, pick him up and carry him. And when you see a woman who's broken, put her all into your arms, because we don't know where we come from. We don't know what we are. And I've always found that we don't know where we come from and we don't know what we are. And I really do subscribe to that attitude that you can spend a life worth learning things, but in the end, there's a mystery to life that we don't know what we are. We may as well be kind when we see somebody who needs it.
Well, yeah, I think through a lot of the story that we'll get into today, we'll see how that kind of flows through your approach as a business owner. Yeah, so to kind of get us into that story, what exactly prompted you to think about selling Alternative Technologies?
Well, primarily as I aged, it was more difficult for me to work as many hours as I used to work. And so I would say it's age related that I needed to slow down. And so I did. And I put plans in motion to get me out of the business.
Yeah, and what were some of those like sort of top of mind considerations as you were starting to think about that?
Well, money was one. I had to make sure I had enough to retire, although there's never enough, but I had certain minimums that I had run my own budgets on. And next, and equally important to that, if not maybe even a little more important, was protecting my employees from a potential buyer who might throw them off out of work. I had had staff who worked for me for over 25 years, and the thought of them being laid off at a late stage in their own lives was difficult for me to countenance. And so I wanted to, if I could, do something to protect them.
Yeah, so with those two kind of priorities in mind, making sure you get a fair price for yourself and your retirement goals, but then also protection of your employees, what were some of the actions you took to plan your exit?
Well, it was a scattershot approach at first. I hadn't really thought a lot about it. I'll be honest with you. I was always working hard, never really thinking much about my upcoming retirement. But the first thing I did was contact colleagues who had sold their business. And that was interesting because their approach was different from mine. They were maximize the dollar. And I wasn't, although I wasn't opposed to doing that, that wasn't my primary. It was one of several goals, not just the only goal. And so that became pretty clear for me from talking to my colleagues that their approach wasn't going to be my approach. Quite honestly, their approach in business had never been my approach in business. So that made sense. Although we were collegial, we were not the same in terms of our business approach. Then I talked to my financial advisor and my CPA. CPAs have much more say in what you do than I knew going into business, that's for sure. Well, I had to figure out what made sense for me monetarily in terms of if I were going to sell it, how to be paid out, and that kind of stuff. And then I did something that really paid off, which was I formed a task force within my company to take the journey with me to see what was possible. One of the things that came up that I initially thought of was selling to my management. I was in a technology business. It's called Alternative Technologies, as you mentioned at the start of the program. And I thought perhaps I might sell to them. They were three women in a technology business, and that's unusual that you had, at that time at least, women actually running all aspects of the business. And I wanted to initially sell to them. I said, "So you want to buy it?" Kind of funny, what? I said, "Well, I've been thinking about this." Then I said the magic words, and by the way, you're probably going to have to put your house up as collateral. And they all kind of freaked out. So we started thinking realistically of what might happen. We pretty much moved off of the fact that they wanted to spread the risk. Let me put it that way. I think that was their calculation. They didn't want to take on the sole risk of making sure there's payroll each month.
Just to be clear, so then the task force and the management team were synonymous with each other?
The initial task force, there were two task force. The initial task force was just the management team and me and figuring out what to do. And then once we came into the employee ownership model and we talked about that and we did some initial exploration of that, we then formed a larger task force of 7 people within the company who became the leaders for the employee ownership co-op. They became the forerunners of the co-op, and we worked 2 years, for God's sake, on it.
I can hear a little bit of feedback that maybe was a bit longer than you wanted it to.
Well, we were in the middle of a pandemic, so that didn't help. That slowed everything down. It was a mess, just in terms of business. And as you probably remember, I mean, it's like the entire economy was almost froze, and it was dicey times. So I'm trying to sell. The economy is frozen, and so it just slowed things down immeasurably.
So for these 7 folks that came together, it's kind of what united them that they had all exhibited leadership qualities. Is that what you were thinking about?
Well, I chose them. I actually went through thinking about the different departments and trying to pick somebody from each department so that there was representation from sales, from tech support, from admin, things like that. And I tried to choose people who were, well, I have to say it, smart.
That helps.
Yeah, there are a lot of good hearts, but in something like the sale of a business, you got to get some savvy staff people to represent the interests of their departments and the company that they're going to own. And so I was careful in people I chose. And I also people I was interested who could work together. So it was a fairly delicate process, more delicate than I thought. And it worked. There was only one person who had, I wouldn't say time constraints, but that's not how he wanted to spend his time because the resources that we put into it were an incredible number of hours. I allowed, and not even, well, I don't know if that's the right word, but we had business hours during the day. So that took away from 7 people out of 40 spending hours a week figuring out how to employ, how to buy the business was a pretty significant investment on my part because it really did affect the bottom line. But anyway, in the task force, only one person couldn't deal with the detail of the conversions because there are a lot of them.
Absolutely, yeah. And we'll get into sort of the working with finding a consultant, working with a consultant. But yeah, so you mentioned the pandemic. I wanted to sit there for a moment. So you mentioned the economy freezing. It seemed like it had a fairly polarizing effect on the economy, right? That many businesses either like sort of took off in some way because of the pandemic. I imagine as in the technology space, you're probably more in a position to do better because of the pandemic. Is that fair?
No, it not. No, that wasn't my impression upon with my colleagues or anything like that. Um, our niche, and this is the reason I think my company was successful, was the nonprofit world. And the nonprofits were scared, and people had stopped giving to the nonprofit. And so there was the technology needs, though were still the same. And in fact, as you point out, they had shifted a little because they shifted from going to the office to working remotely. It wasn't an atmosphere where people wanted to spend money. In fact, if anything, they were freaked out and wanted to pull back and wait and see. But we were able to straddle the precipice. And by that, I mean um, we had enough support from the PPP program and things like that that the government put in place to keep all our staff on board. We didn't lose anybody during that time. So we came out of it and but the planning and the economy was dicey for us.
Yeah, and part of the reason I wanted to get into that question is because something we think about a lot at Solidar is, within our sort of indicative valuation, we have a tool called the AHA Planner where we're talking about, sort of first snapshot value of a business. I
Yeah.
was curious if, did you have a tool in this time to be looking at the value of the business? And if so, was it impacted by the
Yeah, it's
pandemic?
called that's called the grapevine. Everybody tells you how to do it. As you know, I mean, you know better than I do. I've seen your website. It's fabulous. I wish I had had it, frankly. And so at the time, I asked my CPA, I go, "What's this thing worth?" I had no idea. He goes, he said, EBITDA or something like that. I said, "What are you talking about?" It stands for, I don't know, taxes. It's your profit margin before you have all sorts of taxes and things that you have to factor out. And so that reduces your core net worth. And then they say, well, you multiply that between 2 and 5 times, depending on the market, maybe more if you're a bigger company. And that's your magic number. And so I learned pretty quickly that that magic number wasn't as big as I had hoped, but it served as a an initial jump off point, but in the end was it's a market-driven proposition. I mean, I had contacted, just to be thorough, I'd contacted an outside consultant who sold businesses as people normally do, as either merger and acquisition or just to sell to some other party who wants to buy your business. And he had all sorts of ways of thinking about it. And then the number was, well, at one point there was a range, and he just said, "Well, whatever we can sell it for." So it was kind of weird.
Right? Because we would hope like, oh, it's like a house, right? So it's like this is what the price is, right?
You felt you're going to go to eBay or something, and somebody's going to quote you a price for bid on it. I came to a number. I took the lowest number of the what I thought was fair, and then proceeded with that. And that proved to be a problem no less. So that was kind of funny. I had this bottom number, and I came in and I go, "Ah, all right, I'm such a good guy. I'm going to take the bottom number of all the evaluations I saw." And then I was told, "Well, you can't borrow that much money." So I had to do some creative things, which I'm sure you're going to ask me about later on.
Absolutely, yeah. Um, so yeah, so you'd spoken to the CPA, and then you also had this M&A advisor as well. You had some other tools for methodology. So those were the kind of two key tools you had. Is that right?
Yeah, and colleague.
Okay. And then, yeah, so I want to then step again back a little bit to, so we were at this point of, we had the two different task force. So the first was the management task force, and, you were like, want to put up your house for collateral. And then, no, no, no. Okay. Now we're
Forget
pivoting
that.
to let's spread the risk, which we know from knowing the story that the worker co-op then became the answer. But I'm curious, like, how did that conversation about risk go? How are you explaining risk, and how are the employees thinking about it?
I don't know if it's a dirty little secret. I don't know that they really understood it. Frankly, there's certainly, I'd say, 10 to 20% understood it, but in some ways they weren't at risk for all that much. I mean, what we opted to do was, bought into the co-op model by putting up a lot of money, which in the scheme of things is relatively modest for the employees. It hurt a little bit. They had to come up with $2,500, part of the employee ownership model, and that was their risk aside losing their job, and so that's manageable in the scheme of things over a lifetime. So I don't know that they were on the hook for very much, and it's the lender who was on the hook because the employees could walk away, or the employee owners could walk away. There wasn't much they didn't have to sign personal guarantees. So the co-op protected them over and above their initial investment.
Yeah, and I think to help us also, because you mentioned the crucial role of the lender in that, so maybe we could go there for a moment. Could you talk
Sure.
about, yeah, how did you approach the lending and the financing?
Well, it was interesting. Had a bank who was set up primarily to help co-ops get off the ground. And so we found out who they were. And so we went to them and they said, "Yeah, we'll give you X dollars." And that wasn't enough. And so then I had to get involved. And I am now a person who has loaned money, in essence, to the company because I'm taking something called an earnout. I don't know if you've spoken about that, or in your website you talk about what an earnout is, but that's when an owner basically gets paid out over a length of time for the amount that he or she is owed for the company. So when you have the earnout amount that that the company will pay me, and add that to the bank initial loan, that's how we finance the sell.
Yeah, could you, if it's okay, could you
Sure.
put that in sort of like in terms of percentages of what that price ultimately was? So how much
I
banking,
have to think about that. It was like probably two-thirds, one-third, two-thirds from the bank, one-third from me.
and just to and to underscore that point with the 2,500 you mentioned, so that ended up being like a nominal portion, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it didn't raise a lot of money for the company. And that's the interesting thing. You have to really, when you go this route, the one thing there are a lot of deep pockets around, and so it get a little bit hairy. Or really, what it is that the owner sometimes has to take on more risk than they were necessarily initially calculating. I mean, I wanted to walk away, frankly. I wanted all my money. I wanted to walk away and wish them well. But now I am still involved. In fact, tomorrow I give a speech at the end of a all staff meeting to say goodbye to a staff person. And I didn't think I'd still be involved. I'm on the board of directors for the co-op, but that was, I placed myself on the board. I actually required it as part of the earnout. I says, I'm going to owe you that much money, or you're going to owe me that much money, then I need to be on the board. I need to at least have, and I have, in my situation, I was a little bit rough, requested, and well, demanded that I get veto power over management hiring.
That's during the period of the earnout.
Yeah. Well, nah, I only took 3 years. You can't. I don't want to be on for 6 or 7 years. They're not. It's gonna last, and
Oh,
that's
it's
a
about
risk.
twice. Mhm.
Yeah. But that if they make it 3 years, which I'm sure they will, then it shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, long enough to get used to this, some of the change in governance and all that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just to linger for a moment on that 2,500. So were you a part of that discussion of how 2,500 became the number?
No. Actually, I was and I wasn't. Throughout the process, I allowed the team, the task force, to make the decisions. I just had to be told what they were. In other words, they needed to construct their own co-op. They needed to buy into that co-op both monetarily and philosophically. I didn't want to have my fingerprints all over it. They they did it. They worked really hard. They worked, like I said, during business hours, so that was an expense that I shouldered. But it worked in the sense that it wasn't something that I constructed. It was their baby.
So, okay, so you've done a couple of, you spoke to your CPA, you got a number, you're like, oh, not sure. You engaged this other consultant who's an M&A consultant, looked at the couple of different methodologies, and you got a range, and you're like, I'm going to take the lower part of that range, and you're going to come up as the knight in shining armor. You're like, I took the low number, and they're like, nope, that's not going to work. So
Like limbo, go lower.
yeah, you're like, you feel like you kind of can't. So like, how did that conversation go with this forming worker co-op and back and forth?
Well, I have to say, I mean, if you were to see the company and to see the players in the company, and we're friends, and so it wasn't adversarial. It never broke down. It broke down a couple times.
We went in all around.
There are freak out moments in this entire process. And I had one of them when I was thinking, how can I retire? I had thought I come to the zen of it, so to speak, and having to get my payout over the 6 or 7 year period. A happy time for me. So anyway, got upset when I got upset, but since we were long-standing workers who had gone through a lot of growth pains and gone through a lot of pain just in general in technology, keeping people's computers and phone systems up and working, we were used to a lot of stress, and they realized I just needed to freak out and come back to myself, and vice versa. They freaked out and I let them come back to themselves. And so that was one thing that I learned, and this is not to shift the conversation at all, and we can stay on this, but I learned to trust the process, which that's not me. If I don't invent the process, I don't trust it. And I had to become much more calm about the fact that I'm not going to control this whole thing.
Thank you for framing it that way at the Zen and learning to trust the process. And that helped you kind of calm down, even though you also had some of these storming moments. And so did this group of 7 who were sort of leading the transition charge from that side of it.
Well, actually, I only freaked out in front of the senior staff, the 3 out of the 7. I at least knew not to take the junior staff and see their leader kind of lose it.
Seems thoughtful of you, yeah, which is
Yeah, well,
really
I
a
don't know.
theme to this story, yeah. So I'd like to, transition our conversation a little bit more into the transitions. And like now we're sort of getting down the line. We've got this committee formed, that they're having meetings, they're coming up with some of their own decisions. They did form their own legal entity as the co-op, or
Yes.
okay, yep. So they've formed their own legal entity that's actually going to take ownership of alternative technologies. So you're finding out and becoming unhappy because you realize, okay, there's going to be this 7-year earnout period. You're going to stay on the board of directors as part of the way you're engaged. Was also part of that you would remain operationally engaged?
No, that was not negotiable.
So you would just stay at the board
And
level at this
frankly,
point.
by that point, they didn't want me part engaged. Yeah. As much as I delegated authority in general, I was still the bottom line. They wanted, as this was a sign of maturity in my estimation, they wanted to take over. They wanted me to retire. That was a goal of theirs, not because they wanted me out, although that was part of it. They also wanted to see me stop working.
How big of a shift was that for you? I mean, so had there previously been a board of directors?
Yeah, it's president, treasurer, vice president, secretary.
Right, depending on the day of the janitor, whatever is needed, right?
That was the joke when I was first started the business. I'd answer the phone, and if it was a client I didn't want to talk to, I just said I was a janitor.
You are lying.
No, I wasn't.
So that's a shift, right? Yeah. So now you're sitting in this board seat. You're looking at the business as more of a governor. You do have some special power here, right? Because you can veto management hiring decisions. Is there anything else dramatic or surprising in the shift to becoming more of a governance position?
Because employee ownership is a very different mindset from a sole single owner. Because employee ownership can tend to be a little conservative in their approach. And so when I'm sitting on the quarterly meeting and they're talking about minor issues, I'm like going crazy. In fact, the other day I called up the president of the board and I said, spent an hour talking about X dollars. Are you kidding? That nothing. Why are you? Stop it. I realized I can't. I sent it to him, but I realized that I can't remind me, trust the process. We have to go through this in a co-op because of their inexperience and all that stuff. So yeah, it would have been better if I could walk away, but I can't. And so I try not to get too deep into their decisions unless I think if it's really categorically catastrophic, and then I'll speak up.
Then you'll get into some of those powers that are uniquely yours.
Yeah, yeah. But so far, that's actually not been anything I've had to seriously contemplate because the people who are still running the company ran it with me for 10 years. They're as a collective, these managers are smarter, better, faster, the more bionic than I am. And so they're in good hands.
Makes it easier to trust the process, right?
Yeah. Well, that's why I said I have to control who the managers are for the first 3 years.
Yeah. So I also want to talk about sort of who else is essential to this equation. Sometimes we use the term deal team to say who all was needed in order to make this transition successful. So who else was helping out?
Well, we had an outside consultant who had experience in helping people form co-ops. I don't tell many people this on this side of my life, but I'm also a lawyer. And so I was able to read the documents. I kind of understood them. I had a good friend of mine who's a lawyer down Southern California. I'm in Northern California, and he helped me parse a lot of the stuff that I didn't want to get involved with and learning. He would tell me what his opinions were. And so there was that, and the outside consultant and the management team, and that's about it. We were able to get our way through it with those people, those players.
So just to be crystal
Well,
clear
there
there,
was a
so
lawyer. There's also a lawyer for the
that's what I was also curious about. Yeah,
yeah. So we
but sort of you are your own legal representation. It sounds like.
oh yeah, saved a lot of money.
So just curious, like what that process looked like, because obviously there tends to be potentially, many different legal documents that are involved in the process of creating
Yeah,
these
there are.
transitions. Did you feel like what was your process of knowing like what legal documents would be necessary?
Oh, I didn't claim. We used a consultant who helped lay it out. We hired an attorney, and the attorney started churning them out. And then once they churned them out, I looked at them, and my lawyer friend from Southern California looked at them, and we corrected them. We edited them.
Personalized, yeah.
Yeah, the lawyer was experienced in the formation of employee ownership co-ops. So they started the process and they kept feeding the process. And then, like I said, we edited them. And the co-op team did as well. They were a little less experienced and they kind of relied upon me to sort of say, this doesn't seem clear. We need to think about it.
Okay, so that's interesting. So the co-op team, the seven folks, they also had their own legal counsel that was different, right? They were engaged in their own process, and I imagine that for them, the bylaw development process was crucial, right?
Oh yeah, they took forever. That was the one thing that I was a little frustrated with, but they sweat the details on that really significantly. Yeah, the consultant was kind of surprised at how seriously they took that development of the bylaws. That was voluminous. That's the thing as a single owner, you go, oh my God,
Here's the
forget
bylaw,
the,
my way or the highway.
that's right. That was that was something I had to sit back and just allow because my personality is so not that. And it was, but it worked. I mean, their bylaws, the staff says, I want to do this. They go, well, let's look at the bylaws. By God, the bylaws tell them what to do. So it was really worth the investment of time.
Awesome. And curious also in terms of sort of the tools that went into all of this, would you say, did you have like a roadmap that kind of gave you a sense of like A to B, C?
It was that was something that I wish had been a little clearer. There were a roadmap, but we took longer than they than we were told it was going to take. That was because of the pandemic. That was because the co-op leadership team was anal in their approach. So everything took a lot longer. I mean, well, with the 2 year, was a 1 year process really came to 2.5 years.
And being really deliberate with the process, that's kind of what was driving that, you say?
Yeah, that was it. Those two factors. They really did slow things down.
But it's, yeah, so I mean, you mentioned like you really saw the upside of it was sort of in the quality of what the team was producing as a result. Is that right?
That's true. That makes a big difference because people, if you don't rush them, they feel empowered and they were able to wrestle down all sorts of minutia. And so it's a strong foundation as a result. And the company doesn't have a lot of questions about how things run. They can change the bylaws if they want, but the bylaws have thought about just about everything.
Of course, being a technology company ourselves, I mean, do you think there were ways that, like, how do you think maybe technology could have helped to speed any of that process up?
Well, that's what I was saying. That if we had something like Solidar, where we could have seen just about everything. I mean, you can jump ahead, you can go backwards, your website would have been really helpful in terms of determining what was in front of us. When it's all laid out there, the way you guys have done it would have been very helpful, I guess is what I'm
Yes, a quick shout out to Deborah Farrell, who's a big part of this and is also starting out on a consulting practice. I was talking to Deborah a little bit about this, and I was showing that we're soon to launch our community, which will involve a knowledge base / wiki. We'll also have a forum. And Deborah's first comment was, "I would have been living on this website during this time."
yeah. We would have been. Yeah, that would have been really helpful. The knowledge is so spread out and not centralized. I mean, things like that you do in terms of determining sale prices would have been much faster and much more organized and much more comprehensible because you, the owner, can play with the numbers yourself. Ask all sorts of, if I understood it right, a lot of what if questions.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's two different ways. So one of which is, of course, we have our chatbot. So our AI chatbot, Solid AI, has been trained on employee ownership. But then there's also literally what we're about to add as well is what we're calling a what if analysis. So with those
Oh,
numbers, you can
really?
actually create scenarios to model
Yeah.
them out.
That, yeah, like Deborah said, I would have lived on that, And I can see owners. What's really good about it is that owners can come into that and see how they don't have to necessarily just sell to private third parties. They can go, oh, look at this. This is, if I follow this process, I can get this done. And if they have attitudes like mine, which were, I want to protect my employees, or I just think this is a great idea, it would have been invaluable.
To go back to that term freak out, do you think it maybe would have helped out with some of that? Like make that a
Oh,
little
I don't know
easier.
about that. I freak out easily. But yeah, in theory, that's true. Or for more measured people, more measured owners or calmer owners. Yes, that would have been that. It would have helped the freak out factor.
Yeah, I was sort of curious. It sounds like freakouts and were kind of sometimes arising from, okay, this is taking longer than expected. You weren't going to get exactly the price that you thought you would in the process. Were there any other surprises along the way?
Employee ownership has a different mindset than a small partnership or single owner. It really is. And you have to give up your notions about how business necessarily runs and making decisions.
And that was on the side, of course, they have to decide things like the bylaws, but it sounds like you're thinking about something bigger as well.
Yeah, I'm thinking about entrepreneurial spirit. Employee owners can be sometimes, not always, risk averse. So you have to be wary of that if you're a co-op. You can't, especially technology, it changes and you must be agile. Sometimes being agile means you make a bad decision. I mean, like ours, I've told them just the other day that I didn't think they were being agile enough, that they needed to be a little bit risk accepting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I do see example. We tried to do photocopiers. That was the biggest mistake we ever made, but it was still a risk worth taking because we found out. So anyway, that co-ops can be because they can't. They have to make that transition from being workers to owners, and workers can sometimes be a little bit tight with decisions that could affect their livelihood.
Yeah. And there's something about that, like you just said about the photocopier example, where like you were in a mindset because you had the power, you had the risk, you had the investment. You functionally were in some ways alternative technologies that when you saw an opportunity like photocopiers, you knew and you could zone in on like, we have to
Oh
take this
well,
risk.
photocopy is a funny one because I actually said over my dead body when they came to me with the idea, but I accepted the idea, and then it was a big mistake, and I got to say I told you so. But we still took the risk, and we had budgeted how much we were going to lose, and we lost it, and then I said, "That's it, we're out."
The decision to do that, right? That you knew like, okay, this is a risk worth trying. Yeah.
Yeah,
How do you do
co-ops
that
have,
collectively is the question.
yeah, because you have a lot of people and the collective who worry about losing their job because when you take a risk, could mean cutbacks and all sorts of things.
I want to move a little bit more towards sort of the post transition. So some of the reflections that you've had through this process. So looking back, how do you feel about choosing worker ownership as your exit path?
I feel really good about it, actually. The way if you at the time I thought it was the right thing to do, and I'm convinced it is the right thing to do. I think that I started the podcast out by the song from Laurie Anderson, which talks about picking people up and embracing them. I just think that owners need to give to their staff because their staff is what made you a company in the first place. So anyway, it's just a lot of people disagree with me about that, but I have a strong ethic. And so I think now, the same as I thought at the time, that it's the right thing to do, and I'm glad I did it.
Would you say like you had been building the company toward this kind of an outcome all along?
Yeah, the company, my wife calls it my monkey business, but the notion there is that profits were not always the bottom line. Doing good work, we service nonprofits. And so what was nice about it is that even as a staff person, you could feel like you were helping the world, either battered women's shelter or environmental groups or whatever. By helping them, you were helping the world. And so we were a company that always emphasized the value of its employees. And as one of the things that made us who we were. And so the employee ownership model was dovetailed right into that. I started the company with that in mind, that if somebody was sick, you took care of them. That if somebody we made sure that they had medical benefits and that they had retirement benefits. These were all things that before they were really talked about in things like B1 corporations, whatever. So yeah, I think that without necessarily knowing that I was going to go to an employee ownership model, I certainly was aware that the employees are it's a symbiotic relationship. It's not just me as the boss. They deserve representation and what happens to the company.
You'd always had this sense of, yeah, purpose as well as profit.
Yeah. Yeah, I worked 10 years in a nonprofit myself, so I got schooled in business on that model, which is a little different mindset. Nonprofits have a different mindset than a for-profit. I took a nonprofit mindset into the for-profit world, and then we became an employee ownership co-op.
What achievements are you most proud of, and do you have any regrets?
The company itself is my most proud achievement. That when I started, I was a person of one, and that we to 40 people. And regret, no, it's funny for all my freak outness. You try your best, and whatever happened, if you tried your best and you were honest about how you dealt with things and people, if it didn't work, then you're not to blame. So I don't have regret necessarily.
But
Just green energy. It didn't manifest itself, and yeah, that those business risks are the easiest to not care about. I mean, yeah, it's just business, and it comes and it goes, but it's how you treat people along the way that matters. So I have no regrets about that.
moving to our last couple of questions for closing thoughts, what's the first step you'd advise an owner who's thinking about exiting their business?
Well, I've used the phrase "trust the process." That I had to figure out. I don't be afraid of the employee ownership model. It's the right thing to do. So those two things is learn to trust the process. And again, if you don't trust the process, you have Zolidar, who you can sort of figure out what the process is and whether you appreciate what it can bring you.
Well, I would still say, yeah, probably trust the process, but we can also help to make it easier to trust the process, hopefully.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
And is there anything that maybe you wish I had asked about your transition that I didn't, or anything else you think the listeners should know?
I'd be kind of curious to know if the audience had any things that they wish we had spoken about, but I can't think of any.
And that's actually sort of my follow up there is, is there anything you'd like to hear from the audience if they were to reach out to you, and how can they reach out to you?
Oh, they can contact me, call me, email me, that I'm open. I'm pretty friendly.
I'd certainly say so. And sorry, maybe you could just also underscore, is there something you'd like to hear? Question, just any
Oh yeah,
questions?
sure. I'm a curious person. I'm also a person who likes to help. And so if I can help somebody get to an answer of some sort, I used to teach. In addition to being an ex-lawyer and running the business, the technology business, I also taught and was a tenured professor at the same time. But that's
Oh,
another story for another time. but it shows you I like to help. I like to teach. So it's always something that's in the back of my mind. So yeah, somebody's got a question they want an answer that I can provide them. I'm happy to help.
Thank you so much, Jerry. Yeah, you've been a great help to us, certainly to the employee ownership ecosystem, helping to spread the
Yeah.
word about your story, and just exemplifying exactly the quote we started with. So picking people up and putting them into care as you can and as you will. So thank you
Yeah,
so
but I
much for
don't
being
know
with
where I
us.
came from or where I'm going, but I'm happy to do that.
All right, thanks so much, Jerry.
All right. Take care.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this valuable, you can subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that helps other listeners find the podcast. You can find all past episodes or learn more about the show at zolidar.com/podcast. Also, we'd love to feature your voice in an upcoming mailbag episode. Maybe you've got a question for us. Leave us a voicemail at 650-36565. Or if you prefer, send an email to social@zolidar.com. But remember, voicemails make for more engaging episodes. We really do want to hear your actual voice. All right, y'all. See you in the next episode.